Well, we're going to continue in our studies here in creation. Last or several weeks ago, I guess, whenever we were back on creation, we weren't here teaching on that last week, but the last time we were here teaching on creation, we were looking at the first half of chapter 8, going through it, getting together some statistics from chapter 8. We really won't be back to chapter 8 and finish up that chapter for several weeks because we've got some other things to look at according to our outline. And there are a couple of things on our outline that we're going to be skipping over. For right now, I think they'll fit best towards the end of our study when we start looking at some more dates for the age of the earth. But we're down on page 8 under number 4. We're looking at effects of the flood anthropologically, faunally, physiographically, and florally. And that's the final of the 4 areas where we're looking at the effects that the flood has had upon various inhabitants of the earth as well as the earth itself. Now tonight our subject is going to be fossils and minerals. So we're going to be going back into some more of those scientific studies. Good to know where you got that gas that you pump into your car at the gas station. We use a lot of it, depending on how much you drive or what type of car you have. But this is a big area, so we're going to spend all of this evening going just as far as we have time to go on fossils and minerals. Now we'll take them in that order, and we'll begin looking at fossils in the first place. None of us, I don't think, have not seen a fossil at some part in our past life. The theories concerning the origin of fossils many of them border on the fantastic. I want to give you some of those that I've come across in reading on where in the world did these fossil remains come. Now we're going to be looking at different types of fossils. I don't know what your definition of a fossil is, but it's not just an imprint of a fern plant in a rock. Now that is one type of fossil. That's what we've probably all seen. You've seen a little rock that had some type of little imprint in it. That's only one type of fossil. There are about 6 different types that we'll be looking at this evening. Hallelujah. But we're going to look first of all at the origin of fossils as a general category themselves, and as I say, many of these theories that people have invented, and many of the theories have been invented by professing Christians in order to help God out and help Noah out and help especially Moses out as far as creation and the time of the earth's existence are concerned. One of those theories that was invented by a Christian is that God created the fossils in situ, which means in place, in order to test our faith. You know, back with all of Darwin's theories and everything, all the Christians were being shaken concerning the record that God had left us in His Word, especially any of those things back there in the early chapters of Genesis. And so I don't know exactly when all these theories were invented, but my guess is that this was probably invented back somewhere along there. That they were seeing so many Christians fall left and right, so one of them dreamed up the idea. I know where all these strange-looking fossil remains. Another type of remain is bones of a dinosaur. And since we don't have any dinosaurs around today, and those things couldn't possibly have actually lived or would still have them with us today, then a shortcut for explaining how those remains got here is that God created them and it made them look like a dinosaur, but really a dinosaur had never existed, just to test our faith, to see whether we'd still believe the Bible or not. Which credits, on God's account, Him with deception, trying to get us to believe that dinosaurs did exist when really they didn't. Then another view, these are just ludicrous, and they just get more strange as we go along. Another view, just the opposite of that. The devil created all fossils in order to try to deceive the Orthodox believer. And put them right on the path of Darwin and other people like him. Made sure that Darwin found these bones and brought them to the attention of the whole world. And it's a good theory because it helps to explain how so many Christians fell for that. And they say the devil is a master of deception. And so he created these bones or fossil remains or whatever other types of fossils you want to discuss that we'll be mentioning later on. He's the one that did that so that he could deceive believers. And he was very successful, if that theory is true. Another theory is that fossils are caused by the remaining products of fatty matter, which has been fermented by heat. Like the fat you have in your body. I don't know exactly where the fatty matter came from, but it went through a process of fermentation under the influence of heat, and it produced little fossils. One that we'd mentioned before, Voltaire's belief concerning the fossils that are in the hills of Italy was that they were left there, the fish fossils were left there by the Crusaders, as the Crusaders in Europe were headed back to the Holy Land to murder the Turks, all in the name of Jerusalem and Christianity. And Voltaire, he's a famous person that lived quite some time ago. Voltaire is the one that we credit with this belief concerning the fish fossils in the mountains of Italy. Remember, we said earlier, we've mentioned this on more than one occasion, what about the fish fossils in all the other mountains, especially in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California? And those are just two mountains, those in California, those in Italy. They're found in practically all mountains. Wherever you've had someone dig deep enough to look for them, they've been found. And since civilization was in Europe, it's all right. I guess the Crusaders could have left fish fossils, but why be carrying tuna bones around with you when you're headed on a pilgrimage? You'd be at least carrying, some icon with you, a cross or a Holy Spirit dove or something. Splinter of the cross. Or human bones, part of Peter, you'd at least be carrying.
That's right.
But you wouldn't be carrying fish bones with you. Now, this was an educated man of his day. This wasn't something off the wall, although it sounds like that. This was an educated man. But how are you going to explain fossils? These are some of the ways. Another theory was that fossils are nature's abortive attempt to bring forth life that never got beyond the mineral stage. Nature's abortive attempt to bring forth life which never got beyond the mineral stage. Another view is that fossils are placed in the earth, caused to grow from the various materials of the earth by the movements of the stars in the heavens. They got passages in the Bible like Judges 5 where on a superficial reading it would appear as if stars can somehow affect things here on earth. Another view is that fossils were caused by seeds of plants which sank down into the earth through little pores in the earth's surface, and whenever they went down in these little pores, they started to grow as fossils. Another one of the strangest ones, and this is based right on Scripture. You remember back in Genesis 1 where God commands the earth to bring forth life, and the dust ended up bringing forth man in Genesis 2:7, and the animals, he said, let the earth bring forth the animals and bring forth the plants. Well, one of the beliefs was that the earth was supposed to bring life forth, but many of the plants and animals got stuck behind boulders on the way out. They take a literal reading of that, bring forth. And so the earth is trying to, by process of almost childbirth, delivery, bring forth some animals, and some of them got stuck behind boulders. And they couldn't get out from behind they couldn't get out from behind the boulder and died there, and left their bones down there. And of course, the dinosaurs were so big, they got trapped easier than other little things that could work their way out of little nooks and crannies. All those huge dinosaurs never did live. They got trapped there. Then one final belief that tops them all off is the story that I read some time ago about a professor in a university. Now this was, I guess, maybe last century. I don't remember what he was a professor of, but it sounds like that he was a professor of ignorance, because In his particular class, he was teaching that these fossil rocks were created especially by God and hidden in different places in the earth to manifest God's glory. That is, whenever someone found them, it was somehow supposed to manifest his glory. So he had some smart alecks for students that figured out they would try to deceive their teacher, their professor. And so they went out and hid a lot of fossil rocks that they had chiseled out themselves in various places where they knew their professor would be looking for them, digging up in the near future. And as a matter of fact, on some of the rocks, they actually printed God's name in Hebrew and wrote other little biblical Hebrew sayings to make it look more scriptural, actually on these rocks. And so sure enough, Mr. Professor of Ignorance came along and was digging right in the right area and dug up those rocks, and of course there's God's Old Testament Hebrew name written on them, and Genesis 1:1 quoted on those rocks. And so he had a book printed over the whole subject that had pictures taken, or drawings, I guess, before the days of cameras, drawings, facsimiles anyway, woodcuts, whatever you will, of all these different neat fossil rocks that had been found. And, of course, later on it was proven to be a hoax, and he died in poverty because he spent all his life savings trying to buy back the books once they had gotten out in circulation. Now, that's actually a true story by a professor in some university. Now, there's a whole host of examples of theories of ignorant man, and, of course, most of these beliefs have been fostered on whoever was willing to believe them by professing Christians, because the atheists out there in the world, he knows how they got there. Millions and billions of years ago, animals lived and died, and that's how we got the fossils. And their belief is a lot more believable than most of these beliefs here that were dreamed up by Christians, that the earth couldn't bring forth a dinosaur and he got stuck behind a rock. Who's ever going to really believe that? You've got certain birds, and what's really interesting in that particular theory is that the animals that we have on the earth today, on the whole, are much smaller than prehistoric animals. The prehistoric birds, prehistoric reptiles, all of them were larger than the animals that we have today, which helps their belief in saying that they were too large to get past these rock formations. Well, does anyone hold any one of those theories here? I trust not. It may seem a little silly, but that's actually what some people believe about fossils. Now, I don't know what you believe about fossils. I know what I used to believe about them, what you read in comic books and saw on cartoons on Saturday morning. Prehistoric man lived billions of years ago. And what you continually are having pumped into you by advertisements and cartoons and advertisements and all types of things that are continually put before the public, and they've got some reference to prehistoric man, they've got some reference to dinosaurs, they've got some reference to the great age of the earth, and what else can we expect people to believe but what they're deceived into believing? Well, let's come to the formation of fossils and see what actually has taken place with their formation. The first thing we can say here is that fossils are rarely being formed today. And that's where we've got the whole problem originating in trying to determine where we got fossils in the first place. Because if fossils are really the remains of animals that died out millions and billions of years ago, that laid next to a rock so long that eventually the imprint was made upon the rock, if that really happened, then that should be in a continual process. You see, the same thing is true with evolution. Evolution is a fine belief that all these things have evolved. And if they've been taking millions of years, that's fine. But why can't we find just one example a day of something in a halfway stage? It's not quite what it used to be, and it's not its final evolutionary product, but it's somewhere in between. And we've never found something that's in between those two stages. Now, if it's taking millions and billions of years, that's credible, as long as you can find something that's in between one of those stages. Why did they all just, all of a sudden, 10 million years ago, get finally evolved, and nothing has evolved since then? Then you've got to explain that. Now, you may have your evolutionary theory, and it may have worked since the beginning of whenever the beginning was up until 10 million years ago, but what about from 10 million years ago until now? Why can't we find one thing that's in the process of evolution, where you've got maybe a man that still has wings on him, or still has a tail? And you watch out those newspaper reports that you read about little things being born in England that have little tails. I'm talking about little babies that have little tails on them. And why do you have a tailbone? Unless the tail really grew there. Well, did the devil create that to deceive people?
Oh, yeah.
No, it's just part of man's formation. He's got a backbone, and it's got to end somewhere. It either can end at the very tip of a tail on a monkey, or it can end at the lower part of his back and be that tailbone. Doesn't mean that a tail used to grow there. But anywhere you've got a bone, a rib bone, a finger bone, it's got to come to an end somewhere. So why do people have a problem that it came to an end right where you sit on your tail? Now, I'm not talking about the literal long tail, but your bottom. It's good to have that there. You wouldn't want just a lot of nothing there. You want something to rest on. Well, fossils, I'm saying, are comparable to evolution in that we don't have any fossils being formed today. If they took a process of several million years to form, then why didn't one start forming, let's say, 3 million years ago, and it's right in the process of forming right now? You've still got the animal laying next to the rock, and you've still got the process of the formation and the imprintation in that rock of that animal taking place today. Fossils, 99% of the time, only under very, very rare circumstances are they ever formed. 99% of the time, we're living in such an environment with such conditions that fossils simply can't form. You see, they take a very complex system of events on the scale of a major catastrophe in order for a fossil to produce the remain that we see, such as the imprintation of some plant remain in a rock. Why? Because decay, deterioration, and scavengers take care of just about 100% of animals. You see, how are you going to have that animal laying there long enough, and then the bones turn back to dust? And especially, think about something as tiny as the little membranes in the leaf of a fern. How do you think that thing is going to last long enough to laying against that rock to produce some type of imprint in it? It's going to be turned to dust in practically no time. You pull a leaf off your tree, and before any time, it's all crumbled up. And you see, the fossil remains of plants that we have are the whole imprint of the whole thing laid out, just like you ironed it right on there. It's not of a crumpled up leaf, but it takes just a matter of days for a leaf that you pull off a tree to turn brown and become brittle. You'll never get a fossil from that. Then all it takes is a little wind, and it is just blown to ashes. A fish that dies in the sea, you see, we have a whole lot of fish fossils that remain. A fish that dies in the sea rarely ever hits bottom. He's eaten before he ever hits bottom, because there are hundreds of scavengers in the seas and in the oceans, and that's what they live on. And if it ever does hit bottom, it's going to decay there, because you've got water churning all around it. And what happens when you put all of that water right next to that nice, warm, or now cold flesh of that fish is going to help the process of disintegration. Whether a scavenger ever gets to it or not, it's going to decay, it's going to disintegrate. Now, we've given you an example of this in one of our earlier teachings, and that was in connection with the Old Testament references to lions living in Palestine. And we're saying that the process of fossilization doesn't take place today. Only in rare conditions does it ever take place. Now, you remember all the Old Testament references to lions, but never has a bone, a fossil remain of any type of a lion been found in Israel, in Palestine. Well, that should speak for itself. In this country, just last century, whenever the white man began to push his way westward across the plains of the Southwest in the United States, on the way out there, as he destroyed the Indians, there were untold millions of American bison, known as buffaloes, that were slain. There are very few buffaloes that are left, only in, the tens of thousands. And there were untold millions of buffaloes slain, carcasses left to lie and to rot out on the plains. you know what? They left hardly a trace there. And that was just 100 years ago. Hardly a bone of a buffalo can be found now in the Southwest. And it's known from substantiated facts of history that there were untold millions of American bison in the plains of western United States, but no remains. In other words, you've got to have certain types of conditions prevalent at the time if you're ever going to get any type of fossil remain. It's been estimated that, this is a very interesting fact, it's been estimated that the weight of all the plants and of all the animals which have ever lived from the beginning up until the 20th century would equal the mass of the planet Earth. And that may even be a little bit on the small side of the scale. All of the plants, the weight of all the plants, the weight of all the animals. Now, we're going to be going on to prove this later on tonight, but it's been estimated. As a matter of fact, this is unregenerate estimation you can find in some encyclopedias, that the weight of all of the plants and animals from the beginning, whether you want to put it 100 million years ago or a million or 10,000 or 5,000, until the 20th century, equal the mass of the Earth. Now that's just practically beyond imagination, that much vegetation and animal life could have existed in the past. We are finding, and there have been found, not thousands and not millions, but billions of fossils on every single continent in every single country of the world. It's not that they've only been found in one place. There are billions of them. They've been found everywhere. As a matter of fact, in some particular places, there are whole mountains that are made out of nothing but the remains of animal bones. Nothing. No rocks at all. Nothing but the remains of animal bones that have all been compacted together. And, of course, you end up with dirt on top and vegetation. You dig down inside that, and you've got nothing but the remains of the bones of animals, all locked up there together. Now, I don't mean whole bones that have been found there, but the remains of bones. You can do chemical tests on it and find out you don't have rocks there. You've got Siberian mammoth tusks there that have disintegrated and therefore make up the composition of the dust. As a matter of fact, remember when we covered Siberian mammoths? Some of the islands there off Siberia, when they've taken a chemical analysis of the soil, proved to be nothing but remains of Siberian woolly mammoths. Fur and meat and bones all mixed together. And they can chemically prove that the whole island there is made out of nothing but the remains of Siberian mammoths. The only way that we can get a fossil remain is for the animal to die and to be buried quickly in sediment and water. Now, you don't have to be too bright to see that we're already pointing ourselves back to the flood. That's the only way that you end up with fossil remains, and some of your unregenerates will even admit to this. You have to have a death and then a very quick burial in water and sediment. You see, it's locked in sediment, and then the water covers the sediment so that nothing is able to disturb it. Out of these billions of fossils that we have found in the past and are still finding today, and you continually opening up newspapers, you know, a million-year-old skull has found or a 2-million-year-old tooth is found. They're just being found everywhere. And if you do enough digging on your own, you can find not only arrowheads, which of course aren't that old, but you can find actually some of these fossil remains that some of the professionals are out there finding. And what's interesting is that practically all of the modern families and species of animals and plants are represented in fossils somewhere in the world. But what's more interesting than that is that many times the fossil remains of some modern-day contemporary species of plant or animal happens to be found on the other side of the globe where it grows today. Let's say you've got a particular type of plant or animal that's found in Florida, and we've got the fossil remains that can be found sometimes, not always, but sometimes not only there in the locality where we find the modern-day species, but it also can be found on the other side of the globe, which again speaks of water. You've got transportation, then you've got the deposition of that some other part of the globe. And furthermore, not only do we have most modern families, but we've got hundreds and hundreds of extinct families of plants and of animals that have been found in fossil remains. Now, before going on to the types, I want to mention something else that we covered a little bit earlier, and that concerns the remains of some of the lakes that we have. There are lakes known as fossil lakes, which means that just like a fossil plant or a fossil animal in some types of fossil plants and animals, there no longer is a lake there, it's a fossil lake, it's the remains of a lake. And they can tell this. One good example is the tremendous lake that was in the Gobi Desert, which is in China. And it was the size of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, we're talking about lakes, which of course means an inland lake. We don't mean something that's connected to the sea. I'm talking about something, and they found the remains, it's known as a fossil lake, in the Gobi Desert in China that approximated the size of the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, the way you'd spot this is the coastline of it. You know, around the lake, you've got debris and everything that is continually thrown up there on the side. And it doesn't matter how long you go, if you drain the whole lake, unless you just completely bulldoze through the whole area, even hundreds of years from now, you're going to be able to see the outline of that lake. One thing, of course, it's going to be deeper, and then you're going to have some type of coastline that runs all the way around it. And this particular lake, and by the way, the Chinese in their legends tell about the great lake that covered all of China only several thousand years ago. Now, it's not there today for obvious reasons. It ended up, of course, being a shallow lake, and it evaporated. The Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah is another example. Lake Bonneville used to be the size of Lake Michigan, which is around 19,000 square miles. The only remains of that, which is rather large but small in comparison to that, is Little Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake there. That's the remains. And now they have races that take place in the Bonneville Salt Flats in Utah. Lake Tahoe. Now you say, well, Lake Tahoe is still there, just the remnants of Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe was a huge, tremendous lake that took up much of central California as well as western Nevada. And of course, it's a beautiful resort area today, but Lake Tahoe is a small lake. Used to be tremendous. The lakes that we have here in Minnesota are lakes that have remained from the flood. Now, the reason we're covering these is that on the shores as well as at the bottom of what used to be these great lakes in the past that now are only fossil lakes are found many, many fossils of fish, which show us that it used to be covered by a lot of water here at one time. Now, fish, of course, are found other places, but a lot of fossils are found here. You see, most of your great inland lakes we have to trace back to the time of the flood. The Great Lakes here in this country, you see, there aren't any other inland lakes in the world that are the size of the Great Lakes that border United States and Canada, with the exception of some of the lakes in Central Africa. You go to Europe, you go to South America, and there are no inland lakes the size of Superior and Michigan and Huron and Erie and Ontario. And what's interesting about these Great Lakes is that they have no major river source emptying into them. Now, they have a major river source exiting, but no major river source emptying into. Well, where'd all the water come from then? Lake Michigan's 19,000 square miles, and of course Lake Superior is a lot bigger than Lake Michigan. Now, they have a river that exits, the St. Lawrence River, that happens to be, by the way, St. Lawrence River and the seaway that was constructed back in the 50s through there is what made Minnesota such a prosperous state. Otherwise, all of the millions of barrels or bushels of grain, of corn, and so forth here, how are you going to ever get all that over to the eastern seaboard and take it to Europe or take it to Russia or take it to some foreign country? Well, the only way you used to have back in the beginning of the century was the railroads. But it's going to take a lot of cars filling them up with grain to take them there. And that's what made Duluth so famous, because, of course, Duluth is on Lake Superior. And I think it's, around 9,000-mile journey from Duluth all the way You go through Lake Superior. You can bypass Michigan. It extends south. You go through Lake Huron. You go through Lake Erie. You go through Lake Ontario. Is that right? Is that the last one? And you empty into St. Lawrence Seaway, and there you've got your way out. And that became, of course, very important not that many years ago because of all of the Midwestern states. That's the way the grain goes now. And you can get in these lakes, because of the canals and the locks that have been built in them, huge tankers that, of course, can just load up with grain. And that's a cheaper way of doing it, rather than have little old box cars carrying just a teaspoonful of grain. Doesn't matter if you have 500 of them. They're not going to carry any grain like some of these super tankers can. You read in the news about that French oil tanker, that super tanker, that exploded off the coast of South Africa, carrying all that crude oil back from the Persian states, something like 250,000 barrels of crude oil there on one super tanker. And when it exploded, and of course this is a metal ship here, it blew the whole thing in half, just severed it right in half whenever it exploded. Little fire. It's those little foxes that spoil the vines, as the Bible said. Just a little fire, but you don't want to start a fire around 250,000 barrels of crude oil. You're liable to have the whole Cape of Good Hope go up, hoping that tanker never passed by. Well, anyway, another example is the very well-marked skeleton of a very intricate river network in the Sahara Desert that can clearly be seen from space. You can see the trenches where rivers, many, many rivers, used to run through the Sahara Desert. Now, at one time, in other words, there used to be tremendous volumes of water on the earth that ended up going somewhere. And, of course, some of these were in some of these fossil lakes that we've been speaking of. Some of them were in the ancient rivers that don't even exist anymore. Sahara Desert is nothing but that, a barren wasteland of nothing but a lot of sand and very few and far between oases. Well, let's come to different types of fossils, because maybe all you know of are some of the ones we've mentioned, but there are about 6 different types of fossil remains that we have. And we have to find out how we can go about explaining all these. Now, not all of them are the same. There are 6 different types. But we've got to find out how we can go about explaining the origin of these fossils. And we can classify them under these categories. First of all, we've got the category of the entire organism being frozen completely. Now, this is considered a fossil remain. Now, we just mention that in passing because we've already discussed a lot about the Siberian mammoths before. So we include them here because we're talking about fossil remains of ancient species, whether of plants or of animals. A second type of fossil remain are the tracks or footprints. Of course, this would not refer to plants here, but to higher forms of life, such as man and animals. Footprints, tracks and footprints. Now, these were made in a soft clay or sandy substance that was soon hardened afterwards, covered by sediment, covered by water, and has been preserved just in that place. 2 good examples are the Paluxy Riverbed near Glen Rose, Texas, where you've got footprints of dinosaurs and footprints of prehistoric men side by side, but guess where they're found? Where they're still covered by water. And the only time you ever get to see those is during a dry summer, whenever the water happens to be down low enough so that you can see the prints. But they were prints made by animals or by men or animals many thousands of years ago that hardened and then were covered by sand and sediment, and then covered by water, and then preserved. Another good example is the Connecticut River Valley, which, by the way, is where the first dinosaur was discovered in this country back in 1818. So the dinosaur remains here in this country, although since that time they've been quite plentiful, were only recently discovered, just a little over a century and a half ago, 1818, first dinosaur discovered in Connecticut River Valley. All right, we passed by that because we've said some things about the tracks of animals and man. You remember the picture we brought before of the huge human footprint that was just like 5 or 10 of what we would consider a normal man's footprint? Huge. That was made by something that was maybe 15 feet tall. Well, that's no problem. Genesis 6. Amen. In those days, there were some giants, some Gibborim and some Nephilim. And giants they must have been in order to make some footprints like that. And found right by dinosaur footprints, too, which is very interesting, which means that dinosaurs and man lived at the same time. That's right. You see, Earth history professors say that dinosaurs died out, of course, millions of years before man came on the scene, but they're found preserved together. So, enough about that. Another type of fossil remain is probably the one that one of the two probably that you're most familiar with from grade school, and that is the cast or the mold fossil. Here, the original substance of whatever made the cast or the mold has dissolved away in the water, but it stayed intact long enough in order to make an imprint in that soft substance, and then of course was covered by sediment and sand and buried in water. Now the good example here is all of the plant remains that we see. Everyone has seen those little rocks that have the imprints of leaves upon them. And not only that, but you can find even small animals like a little lizard or even a snake, and find the imprint of the bones, the vertebrae, right in that rock or in that stone. And so this is what took place. The original substance, the flesh, meaty substance of the animal, dissolved away in the water. But it stayed there compressed long enough in a soft substance, a soft clay-like or sandy type of stone, to leave that imprint, and then it was covered by sediment. And you see, once sediment fills in those little cracks, then it's not going to pop back up later on. It's going to remain intact just like that. And then when it's buried in water, nothing's going to happen to it until it's unearthed at some later time. And remember, the flood would have buried these in water, but they would have been carried all over the earth. And some of them would have ended up being put right on the tops of mountains. Some of them, as a matter of fact, most of them, of course, would still be at the bottom of the ocean. We'd never discover them. And that's the vast majority of the surface of the earth, remember, is covered 71% by water. We'll never discover those fossils. The ones that we have discovered, hundreds of thousands of millions of billions of them, make up whole mountains, have been found on land, of course. I mean, some have been found in water, but most of them on land. It points back towards the validity of the figure we gave you concerning the mass of all of the prehistoric vegetation and animals. If we have found billions of fossil remains, and yet we've only found just a fraction of them because most of them are underwater. Now the second type that you're probably familiar with above the other ones, the fourth one we're covering, but the second one you're familiar with, is known as the hard parts. Here we've got bones, teeth, shells, and so forth, where you actually have the bones and the teeth and everything preserved. Now I can give you some examples of some very famous places where hard parts have been unearthed. Although, as I say, fossils have been found in every country of the world, there are particular places where particular types of fossils are found. Here's some examples of where you've got a famous location as far as the burial and subsequent discovery of hard parts is concerned. And of course, this is not happening today. You see, bones disintegrate today. But these have been locked in a special place. They were buried there covered by sand and by other sediment and preserved. But you see, that's not happening today. It disintegrates and other creatures get to it too quickly. It lies there and rots too long. And you see, the only thing that can go beyond all of this is the flood. That would have been something that would have killed animals quickly enough, preserved them quickly enough, so that they would have been kept away not only from decay and deterioration, but from scavengers. There wouldn't have been any scavengers. All the scavengers would have been killed along with you, so no one would have been looking for you. And it's the only thing that can account for this rapid burial of all of these remains that we have, because it's not happening today. Even when something slips into the water, it ends up down at the bottom of the ocean and rots right there. So we don't have these formations. But some examples of hard parts: Agate Springs, Nebraska. A very famous place where in one hill, this wasn't a mountain, this was just a small hill, 9,000 complete animals were unearthed. That means all the bones, teeth, skulls, thigh bones, leg bones, everything. 9,000 complete animals found in one hill. Another place is Florissant, Colorado. One of the most, well, I think it is the most famous place in this country for the myriads of insects that have been preserved as a form in its hard part in rocks. Florissant, Colorado, myriads of insects. Another example is Cumberland Bone Cave in Maryland. Where they found hard parts, again we have reference here to bones, of animals such as the wolverine. This is a bone cave in Maryland. The wolverine, the grizzly. Now we know they live together, so no problem finding their remains together, but not so with the other ones, a coyote, beaver, and a muskrat. Just some examples of the diverse animals of which the hard parts were found all in one cave together. Now there are some very famous caves in France where the same thing takes place. You've just got hundreds and hundreds of bones of animals that either didn't live at the same time, according to the geological timetable, or whom, if they did not live in the same region. But why do they all happen to go to sleep and die in the same cave when they didn't even live in that region? They lived in another part of the globe. I remember reading another story about a fossil bone that was brought up in Oklahoma City quite some time ago from an oil well brought up from 6,000 feet below the surface of the earth. And it was some bone of some animal, one of the deepest ones that had ever been found. And it came up from 6,000 feet. Now you see, the archaeologists that are going out looking for these things today, they never dig down 6,000 feet. They just scratch the surface and look under things, and you find plenty right there. So what are you going to do when you dig down 6,000 feet all over the surface of the earth, the 29% that you have available? How many animals do you think you're going to find there? You remember the figure we gave you earlier concerning the possibility of the trillions of human beings that lived on the earth?
Amen.
See, it becomes a reality when you consider that this many plants and animals really lived at that time. Amen. Where you're finding billions of fossils, and we're just scratching the surface and finding these. Say, but the earth couldn't have supported it. Remember, we're talking about the pre-flood stage. You've got luxurious vegetation growing everywhere. You don't have the hostile climate and the hostile environment that we have today. And so one grizzly bear per square mile wouldn't have been the case then. You would have had them just about everywhere. And there would have been some fighting. That's Genesis 6, part of the violence that's going on. You've got so many animals everywhere. And with man's fall into sin and their fall after that, with him being the king of creation, that resulted in all the violence that God never had intended in the beginning. He intended for man, of course, not to fall. Now, don't get theological on me here. I'm trying to make a point here. God intended for man not to fall. That's why he made the garden. That's why he gave him a period of probation. I mean, why have a period of probation? Just why didn't God make him fall himself? He gave the man an opportunity. He gave him a period of probation and says, now you can eat of the tree or not eat of the tree. And if you do, you'll die. If you don't, you'll live forever. Now, was God telling him a lie? Was that not a possibility? God's not telling him a lie. Where he said, if you will obey me in abstaining from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then you'll live forever. So what I'm saying is, the animals would have continued just to live forever right along with him. And although you would have got, of course, millions and billions of animals populating the earth, you've got no sin, no disease, nothing wrong in the world. And you might think, well, eventually the earth is going to be overpopulated, but there was never a problem in that world. There were no problems. So they would never get to a problem of having too many. Now, of course, we know what worked out. That was never meant to be. So we don't have to speculate on what would have happened if Adam wouldn't have fallen and he would have lived 100 billion years. Then eventually, wouldn't there be enough people to just stand on each other's head on the surface of the earth? Well, probably so, but that never happened, so we don't have to worry about that. But the point is, the earth is hiding from our eyes many hundreds of fossil remains that we'll never find. Another example is Lincoln County, Wyoming, where the following various species were found: herring, pickerel, deep-sea bass. How many deep-sea bass you think the fishermen in Wyoming ever catch? 1890, an alligator was found.
For the continual